Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Happy New Year. I know this is my second video of the year, but the last one was pre-recorded well before Christmas, so I didn't even think to include a Happy New Year in it, so here it is. I hope everyone enjoyed their various holidays. I certainly did. We actually had quite a crappy Christmas. By which I mean there was a lot of poop-themed stuff going on, completely unplanned. Starting with TJ, not the amazing atheist TJ, but friend of the show TJ, he sent me a gift package full of poop-themed candy and chocolates. My son chose to get Butthead's action figures for his brother. We decided to give the kids poop on a stick Christmas Eve just to throw them for a loop. They normally get a new set of PJs every Christmas Eve, so they know what's coming, and every year we tell them, no, this time we got you poop on a stick. So this year we really did get them poop on a stick. Oh yeah, also I heard my daughter say shit for the first time, so yeah, really crappy Christmas. Anyway, today I'm looking at the first video in a 16-video series, the Questions for Evolutionists series on CMI Creation Station. I will not be responding to every video in the series, but I'll at least do a few, starting with this one, where they appear to be using evolutionist responses to their previous videos as a way of poisoning the well against the position that evolution really is true. So let's take a look.
Welcome to Genesis Unleashed, the show where we unleash the truth of Genesis.
And pose 15 questions evolutionists have a hard time explaining.
Should probably get this out of the way, though I'm sure it will come back eventually, that having a hard time explaining some aspects of the theory of evolution does not invalidate the theory as a whole. There are lots of things that are completely true that nobody would disagree with that we do not fully understand and have a hard time explaining. I mean, if you think about it, if we just plunked God down as the explanation every time we didn't understand something, then we never would have gained any understanding about anything. There was a time when doctors had a hard time explaining how diseases were transmitted. We didn't just assume that it was because God wills it, we investigated, and we developed the germ theory of disease. There was a time when we didn't understand gravity. We didn't just assume that God keeps us on the ground, we investigated, and we developed the theory of gravity, a theory which, as it happens, is far less understood than the theory of evolution. So if having trouble explaining something invalidates that thing, then gravity isn't a thing.
Our topic today is CMI's Question Evolution campaign, which started a little while ago and really centers around 15 questions that were put together in a tract.
It's this tract,
It's
yes.
this tract that poses 15 questions that evolutionists have an extremely hard time to answer.
Well, I've taken a peek at the playlist, and there are actually some good questions in it that, if asked with a genuine desire for an answer, could be quite educational. But it's also got a smattering of questions that don't even deal with evolution, or poorly phrased questions that assume certain conclusions, along the same lines as the question, when did you stop beating your wife? So there are some videos in there that I am genuinely interested in diving into because I know that I will learn a lot in doing my research to answer the questions, and there are others that seem like they're just the same old creationist tropes that have been addressed a billion times already.
Because many people think that there's this rock solid, evolution's just rock solid, we've got it all figured out, and it kind of really exposes that there are many, many problems and flaws. And
sorry for cutting in at an awkward spot here, but he kind of slips into his next point without giving a good spot for me to interject, so here we are. Here's the thing. They're actually kind of right, but by accident here. So we do know that evolution happens. It is a fact. It has been observed. It has made predictions, and those predictions have validated it. We can trace evolution genetically. We can trace it morphologically. We have entire fields of science that wouldn't be able to exist if evolution were not true. But we do not understand everything about evolution. There are flaws in the theory. There are unknowns in the theory. But as I stated earlier, this does not invalidate the theory as a whole. The admission that you don't know something is the beginning of an educational journey. If you think you know everything already, why the need to learn more? I don't think it's possible, but if a day ever comes when the human race has learned everything that it is possible to learn, that will be a boring time to live in indeed. And also, that's assuming that this would be a civilization that has developed cybernetic implants of some sort that allow every human to know everything. If, however, the race collectively knew everything but individuals did not, then it would actually be quite a fascinating time to be alive, where the answer to any conceivable question is a simple query away. But back to the real world, every theory has unknowns and flaws. I mentioned gravity earlier. Our current theory of gravity is so woefully inadequate that we have scientists actively trying to develop a better theory of gravity to replace it. This is not the case with evolution. Scientists are happy with the current theory and are simply working to understand the aspects that we don't currently understand. But if we ever discover that the theory of evolution is inadequate to describe reality as we have with our current theory of gravity, then you can bet we will start hunting for a replacement. Evolution is not a dogma. It is just the best explanation that we currently have for the diversity of life.
So, of course, this has elicited a kind of a reaction from many atheist groups around the world.
Yes.
People have been emailing in and making comments and so on blogs.
God damn it. I suppose this does fit into that category. You win this round, creationists, but I'll get you next time.
But I will get you next time. Next time.
And so what happened, of course, we posed these 15 questions, and evolutionists have come back, and of course they're trying to defend their belief system.
Sure.
And come back with some rebuttals, of course, and then we have also rebutted their rebuttals.
So does that make this video a rebuttal of the rebutted rebuttals? Rebuttal is a weird word, don't you think? I mean, if you break it down, it seems to mean to have buttled again. Is that what butlers do? They buttle? So someone who gets hired as a butler a second time is a rebutler whose whole life is a rebuttal.
You'll buttle as you did before.
And,
Right?
yes. Looked at they've attempted to answer those 15 questions.
Right.
And then we've come up with a rebuttal to those supposed answers.
I'm sure we can all agree that random emails and comments on the internet are where you find the very best arguments in favor of your position. But that's the genetic fallacy. They might actually be good, so let's see if you're picking the cream of the crop or the worst of the worst.
And we're going to do a number of programs here on Genesis Unleashed, going through each one of those 15 questions
Right.
for evolution.
We're going to go through every one and explain them so people can tune in and they can look at that. But what we wanted to do here was there were some general objections just to the whole concept, just to the campaign itself, or just to the fact that we posed these 15 questions. And so that's what we're going to deal with here.
Here's my problem with your campaign. You don't seem to be asking questions from a position of honestly wanting an answer. You seem to be asking for the specific purpose of just poking holes. So any answers that don't fit your narrative get ignored, discarded, or just hand-waved away. And don't take my word for it. Look at what they say in their What We Believe page on their website, right at the very bottom in section D, subsection 6. Facts are always subject to interpretation by fallible people who do not possess all information. By definition, therefore, no interpretation of facts in any field, including history and chronology, can be valid if it contradicts the scriptural record. Right there, it specifically says that if a fact contradicts your worldview, you consider it to be invalid. Sure, you couch it in the language of interpretation of facts, but a fact itself doesn't really have much of an interpretation. Facts are just data points. Evolution is a fact. Evolution is the change in allele frequencies in a population over successive generations. This is a thing that happens. It is a fact. It is measurable. This is the fact of evolution. The theory is more where the interpretation comes in. Creationists like to claim that these changes in allele frequencies can't possibly add up to the large changes that would lead the first simple single-celled organisms through the evolutionary history all the way up to the different forms of life that we see today, but they always fail to describe the mechanism that would stop these changes from adding up, instead relying mostly on personal incredulity.
And then we'll deal with the specifics in later shows.
Right. One of those objections was the first one that we have here, and you can look at all of this at creation.com. Of course, if you go there and you can download even PDF flyers, print out your own if you want. Although you can get them from any CMI office at great bulk rates to hand them out. Yep. Here's one of the objections: these questions are only unanswerable because our science isn't advanced enough.
I mean, it's possible that some of the questions will never be answered definitively. Like, I know in this series you guys get abiogenesis mixed up in the evolution debate, so I'll just touch on that. So Even if we conduct an experiment that sees something that would definitely qualify as life spontaneously arise from a simulation of the prebiotic Earth, there is no guarantee that that would be the exact same pathway that life actually took. It is possible that there were more than one possible pathway for life to develop, and it is quite possible that we will never be able to narrow it down to one specific path with any degree of certainty. This does not mean that it didn't happen. This just means that we might not be able to find out for sure. But it is reasonable to expect that future scientists will be able to figure out the solutions to problems that plague us today, because that's how science has always worked so far, and there's no reason it shouldn't work that way in the future. But to put the onus of discovery on future scientists is the lazy answer. It is much more interesting to research these topics for yourself and find out where the limits on our actual current knowledge is, and to see what exactly is being done to expand these limits, rather than appealing to some hypothetical future where the limits are probably expanded.
Okay, point number one, they're unanswerable. The skeptic has admitted these are unanswerable.
Okay, I can't believe I have to point this out, but you're not really winning any points here. The commenter obviously meant currently unanswerable, so latching onto the fact that they use the word unanswerable and acting all smug about it doesn't do anything to make your point. It just makes it obvious that you are misunderstanding it, and it actually makes it look like you're misunderstanding on purpose rather than accidentally.
So that's point number one I want to make.
Yeah, and the rebuttals. We'll just kind of summarize these. Maybe read through a bunch of them. The rebuttal starts off with, "But if science has not yet advanced, then how could they possibly know what can be answered in the future?"
That's kind of the beauty of science. We don't know what we will learn in the future. But we can look at the kinds of things that we have learned so far and extrapolate them out into the future based on our current areas of research. But yeah, these extrapolations are often in error. But it is equally erroneous to suggest that no progress will be made.
Generally, non-Christians are opposed to predictive prophecy, especially when it comes to the Bible.
Not at all. Prediction is how science works. You develop an hypothesis and figure out what predictions are made by your hypothesis, and then test these predictions to see if they confirm or falsify your hypothesis. The reason you think we don't like predictions is because the Bible's predictions are so very lousy. They are often so vague as to be meaningless, and when they are specific, they're usually wrong. And when they are right, there is usually evidence to suggest that they were written after the fact. So for a good example of a scientific prediction, let's look at Saturn's rings. For 200 years from their discovery, it was a mystery as to how they could possibly remain stable without breaking up. In 1857, St. John's College offered the Adams Prize to the person who could figure it out. Enter James Clerk Maxwell, of Maxwell's equations fame. He spent 2 years studying the problem, using a combination of math and physics to determine that the rings could neither be one solid piece nor a liquid, and so must be composed of smaller particles each in their own orbit. He published this conclusion in 1859, and his paper was essentially the final word on the subject for more than a century, until the Voyager flyby in November of 1980 finally gave us a direct observation to confirm his prediction. Because that's all it was, a prediction. They observed a ring around Saturn, and Maxwell used math and physics to work out the composition of the ring, something that couldn't possibly be directly observed at the time. And it took 121 years, but his prediction was validated. But his prediction was not some vaguely worded prophecy. It was specific and backed up by known math and physics. And that is how science slowly marches forward.
Right.
So how could you predict what's going to be answered in the future?
With what we know of how things work in the present, of course. How could Maxwell have predicted that Saturn's rings were made up of small chunks rather than being one solid piece or being a liquid? By making predictions based on what was known of physics in his time. When these predictions pan out, they confirm the hypothesis. Had Voyager discovered that Saturn had a ring of gas around it when it got close enough to image, we would have discarded Maxwell's idea. This is why we don't hear about the theory of pangenesis today. Pangenesis was Darwin's idea about how characteristics were transmitted from organism to its offspring. It predicted that all cells in the body would shed particles called gemmules, which would congregate in the gonads, and would carry the information necessary to pass traits on through generations. This would have allowed for Lamarckian evolution, which, despite being named after Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who lived in the 18th century, was an accepted form of evolution going all the way back to Greek antiquity with Hippocrates. And yes, evolution had been a known fact for thousands of years. Darwin is not the father of evolution. Darwin is the guy who discovered one of the mechanisms for evolution, namely natural selection. This allowed our idea of evolution to be refined into a scientific theory, but the broader concept of evolution has been around for a lot longer than Darwin. And sometimes, creationists like to throw this fact at us as if it's some sort of gotcha, as if we need evolution to have come from Darwin himself in order for it to be true. But evolution is not a religion, so where the idea originally came from doesn't really matter as long as the idea accurately describes how the world works.
The thing is, there's this notion that, well, once science advances, then we'll have the answers, but that has not been the case.
How so? We have a lot more answers today than we did even just 20 years ago. Surely you can't look around at all the modern technology that you are using and say that science hasn't progressed in the last few centuries.
Back in Darwin's time, the thinking was that a cell was probably a fairly simple device, a blob of goo, and there were these sorts of notions.
And then scientific processes led to the discovery that that is not the case, which advanced our understanding and answered a bunch of questions like how traits are passed on, how fully formed people can develop from two gametes, how different organs in the body can form and interact with each other. There have been so many questions answered by cell theory and the progress made in cell theory that your assertion that science isn't answering questions is absurd on its face.
But science has not helped the situation for evolutionists. If anything, the advancements of science show the incredible complexity of living things.
And there is absolutely nothing in evolutionary theory that suggests that living things should not be complex. Rather, it actually predicts that living things get more complex as time goes on. And indeed, when we look at the basal life that existed 1 billion years ago, it is incredibly simple when compared to today's life forms.
And it becomes more and more difficult as science progresses for evolution to continue.
Why? Why would the existence of complexity, which is predicted by evolution, make it hard for evolution to continue? Do you care to elaborate on that at all?
That's not a real good answer to this first question.
Darwin was even using things like saying, well, you know, the reason why the fossil record does not reveal evolution, he said that was the weakest link in his whole theory of evolution was, well, we just haven't done enough study.
And the fossil record remains one of the weaker lines of evidence for evolution, despite having a plethora of evidence in it, including fulfilled predictions. The obvious example is the first fossil found of Archaeopteryx, whose head was not quite intact. Based on other basal bird fossils found in slightly earlier strata, it was predicted that when an Archaeopteryx fossil would be found with an intact head, it would have teeth. And it does. So that's the easy example, but one of the more interesting examples, in my opinion, is the prediction of the very existence of Antarctica. In 1893, Antarctica had been sighted, but it was thought to have been a relatively small ice sheet. But using fossil evidence from the Chatham Islands, Henry Forbes not only predicted the existence of Antarctica, but also predicted that marsupials would be found in Mesozoic strata on Antarctica. The Antarctodolops dalei, a 9-foot-tall marsupial, was found in Mesozoic strata on Antarctica in 1982.
Right.
Well, this is 100 plus years later. Guess what? It's really not looking good for them now.
How is it not looking good? The existence of Precambrian fossils was predicted. They were found. The precursors to trilobites were predicted to be found in pre-Silurian rock. They were. The existence of a basal whale with both teeth and baleen was predicted. It has been found. The existence of a primitive reptile with an extra jaw joint near its ear was predicted, and a whole series of them was found, the cynodont therapsids. I could go on. The fossil record, though the weakest evidence for evolution, is still fantastic evidence for evolution.
So yeah, this is kind of the opposite of where this rebuttal should have gone. Objection number 2 was that CMI uses a misleading definition of evolution.
Yeah, probably. I haven't actually heard them define it yet, but they probably define it in such a way as to force it to include abiogenesis, even if they don't go all the way to including the Big Bang like the Hovens do.
Evolution is only the change in allele frequency in a population over time. Well, the fact is, the word evolution gets used for a lot of different meanings.
And we need to make sure that the terms are well defined.
And we do.
Okay. we do, that's right.
In this Question Evolution campaign, we are using the word evolution defined as the general theory of evolution.
That seems a touch circular. It's really as simple as descent with modification. You can get more technical and use the change in allele frequencies in a population over successive generations if you like. Both of those work, and both of those encompass small-scale changes and full-blown speciation, a distinction that is actually rather arbitrary as it turns out. But since you're defining evolution as the theory of evolution, then I guess you won't be including the origin of life in your series, since the theory of evolution doesn't even attempt to explain the origin of life? Well, that's a really... Oh, shit. Question 1 is, how did life originate, isn't it? Well, that was a nice little delusion while it lasted.
Not just simply changes in allele frequencies. That's just talking about one aspect of biological evolution.
That's really every aspect of biological evolution. That's all there is to it. I mean, you can get down into the gritty details about how these changes come about and the mechanisms and why the different genes see different levels of success, but ultimately it all comes down to descent with modification. That covers the whole shebang. Well, I mean, I suppose an argument could be made that that definition doesn't cover selection pressures, but as long as we're talking about populations rather than individuals, it kind of does cover selection pressures. So if you have a problem with that, kindly point me to a paper describing the mechanism by which genetic change is limited to, what, the kind level? Whatever level you want. Show me how the changes are limited, because so far there is no known mechanism that would do that. Any scientist to demonstrate such a mechanism would be making a major breakthrough. Their name would go down in history. So why is nobody coming up with anything in that field?
Which we agree with.
Which we agree with. Creationists agree with.
We'd be evolutionists if that was the definition of evolution.
Exactly.
Great. Video over. You guys are evolutionists. We're done here. Unless, of course, you're about to argue some straw man version of evolution. You're about to argue against a straw man, aren't you?
CMI would be an evolutionary organization.
So if you look at the creationary model and the evolutionary model, and they both share that definition, changes in allele frequency, and we both agree with them, obviously this argument is outside of that.
That's not...
No, it's really not outside that. It's more that you guys don't seem to understand the ramifications of that definition, which fully encompasses both minor and major evolutionary changes. Now, I know you're trying to do that thing where you split evolution up into micro and macro evolution, but until a mechanism is described that stops genetic changes from adding up at a certain point, they will both be different scopes of the same thing. Macro is just a lot of micros. One step at a time can add up to a kilometer walked.
What we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So the evolutionist Gerald Kirkett actually defined the general theory of evolution as the theory that all the living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form.
So let's start with the assumption that you are being completely honest with that quote, and that is indeed how Kirkut viewed evolution. Well then, that is one man's definition, and a man that held an opinion that was outside of the scientific consensus. However, you're missing the point he was making because, surprise, surprise, you're taking it out of context. He was what you would call an evolutionist, in that he accepted that evolution occurs and is responsible for speciation. His dissent from the accepted consensus was more with regards to a single common ancestor for all life. His point is that there isn't enough evidence to be sure that there weren't different common ancestors for different family trees. That is, that abiogenesis happened more than once. Let's read the whole quote. There is a theory which states that many living animals can be observed over the course of time to undergo changes so that new species are formed. This can be called the special theory of evolution, and can be demonstrated in certain cases by experiments. On the other hand, there is the theory that all living forms in the world have arisen from a single source which itself came from an inorganic form. This theory can be called the general theory of evolution, and the evidence that supports it is not sufficiently strong to allow us to consider it as anything more than a working hypothesis. It is not clear whether the changes that bring about speciation are of the same nature as those that brought about development of new phyla. The answer will be found in future experimental work, and not by the dogmatic assertion that the general theory of evolution must be correct because there's nothing else that will satisfactorily take its place. There are two things that it is important to note here. Firstly, this was written in 1960, before genetics solidified the idea of a last universal common ancestor, so the point he was making is now irrelevant, as the experimental work that he spoke of has now been done, and confirmed that there was one universal common ancestor. And secondly, this was the last paragraph of the entire book, so obviously this was not his working definition for the theory of evolution, but his conclusions about different aspects of evolution. And even if this were his definition, it is outdated and wrong. Maybe try using a source that's less than 60 years old next time? In 2010, Douglas Theobald ran a statistical analysis of 23 proteins that are universally conserved between the three major kingdoms of life, eukaryotes, archaea, and bacteria. Through this rigorous analysis, it was found that universal common ancestry is 10 to the 2,860th power more likely than the next most probable hypothesis, which is still common ancestry, but with several different and unrelated common ancestors for the different groups of life. So it looks like that future experimental work that Kirkut was talking about ended up favoring universal ancestry.
There was no life. Then first life came into existence, and then it diversified and became everything.
Yep. And evolution actually doesn't much care about how the first life got there. You can plug your god in there if you like, but no matter which evolutionist you quote, even the outdated ones who are on the wrong side of important issues with evolution, evolution still undeniably happens.
So this is a term, this is a definition that scientists would agree with, evolutionary scientists would agree with.
Evolutionary scientists from 60 years ago may have agreed with it, but it's not exactly a working definition today. Is your point really worth considering if you have to twist and mangle the science and take outdated science that didn't pan out of context in order to make your point?
So it's unjustifiable to criticize us for using that very definition.
No, it is completely justifiable. Because, best case scenario, your definition is outdated, and even if it weren't, it is still worded in a way that disagrees with your conclusion that evolution doesn't happen on a large scale.
So when we're referring to evolution, we mean the grand theory, molecules to man, particles to people. That's what we're talking about.
And we made that very clear in all our literature.
Yes, you made it quite clear in all your literature that you're using an inaccurate definition of evolution. Except what you don't make clear in your literature is that this definition is inaccurate. You just define it that way and pretend that the scientific community as a whole agrees with you.
Yeah. A third objection. Even if science cannot explain the origin of life, to say that God must have done it is an argument from ignorance.
It depends very much on how the argument is made. If the only thing you bring to the table are lists of things that haven't been figured out scientifically yet, maybe even a list of questions, perhaps even 15 of them, and therefore conclude that because these questions aren't answered to your satisfaction, therefore it must have been God, then yes, that is exactly the argument from ignorance. But if you actually have evidence that points exclusively to a God for the parts that science doesn't understand yet, aside from just the fact that science doesn't understand it yet, then that would not be the argument from ignorance. Thing is, though, I have yet to see a creationist argument that doesn't rely almost exclusively on trying to poke holes in the scientific consensus. Creationists have never, as far as I have seen, actually brought any evidence of their own that exclusively indicates a God.
Again, the evolutionists have admitted we can't explain these things.
So fucking what? Not being able to explain something does not prove that it didn't happen, especially when all the evidence points to it having happened. If you have a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle that's missing pieces, it is still possible to figure out what the overall picture would be if you weren't missing the pieces. In fact, you could be missing a significant number of pieces and still be able to tell what the picture is. If all the pieces so far have green bits of grass and blue bits of sky on them, to have someone come along and insist that just because you don't have all the pieces it must therefore be a scene of a winter storm is just plain nonsensical. That's it for this one. Looks like I'm going to have to make this a two-parter. It's getting a bit long. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Nosto, who says, "Though I am an atheist, this Rhino's video is rather weaker than most. Imagine that God is not all-powerful nor all-knowing. Omnibenevolence is less important in this case. And he messed up while creating the world, or was not paying attention. That explains natural evil. Next, Satan is running circles around him, while he is desperately trying to save you in a clumsy way. So he lets kids die while looking for your keys. This may not be ideal, but you get your car keys back, so be thankful. Amen." For context, this was posted on my video where we go into the problem of evil and how free will raises more questions than it answers, and the question of whether or not God even has free will. And I agree with this comment. The easiest way out of the problem of evil and the questions that free will raises is to sacrifice at least one of the omni characteristics. But in my experience, Christians are usually not willing to let the omnis go, so the problems remain. And just two last things before I go today. First, I am now officially making a run at being a full-time YouTuber. I'm down to 1 shift a week at the restaurant, and if all goes well, I'd like to keep it that way. As a part of this, I will be putting out a second video every week, probably on Mondays or Tuesdays, and to help make it sustainable, I'm going to be revamping my Patreon levels. 3D printing goodies will be coming to Patreon soon, and I will actually be regular with my patron-only hangouts. They will now be on the second Sunday of every month at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, starting with this Sunday. Second, I had all my videos for December and last week's video recorded early, so my apologies to any new patrons that haven't been in the credits, and also I have received 3 PayPal donations that I have yet to thank, so special thanks to Alan, Gary, and Tobias. So with that out of the way, remember to follow me on social media and support me on Patreon. See you next time!